winter solstice tree. So, early Merry Christmas. December is this Friday, and I want to do a review of, or a little showcase rather, of Star Trek, vintage Star Trek books. So, I'm 46 years old. I just turned 46 the last day of Scorpio last week. And I've always loved Star Trek. That was something that I enjoyed as a small child, which it was already in syndicated reruns back in the 80s. I was born in 77, and I think that was the year the first Star Trek movie, the movie Star Trek the Motion Picture, actually aired or showed in theaters. And I grew up watching the reruns every day, 8 o'clock after school, and that's probably one of the best memories I have of childhood was watching the original series. It wasn't quite that old back then, the early 80s. So now it seems like totally out of sync for younger kids, for Gen Z and kids that are in middle school now. Like, that's not something they turn on and watch the original series or the cartoons or anything. But that was still very, very cutting edge for us in the 1980s, especially because we had space program that was very active back then. We had the Apollo missions going into the 80s. In the mid 80s, we had the Challenger disaster tragedy that happened. So the space program was definitely at a peak. NASA was at a peak, late 70s, early 80s. And then we had the Hubble telescope in the 1990s. So I've always been a space buff, and because of that, naturally, Star Trek, I don't know, chicken come before egg or whatnot. I don't know if it was the chicken or the egg, which one was, whether it was space, being loving space, or loving Star Trek that made me such a Trekkie, but, that's what I was. And I did collect books back then as a child. So I do have some of my books from that era, as well as my mother's books. I was in middle school. As I got into middle school, the 90s were happening, right? So I started college in mid 90s. I left high school early, actually, and started college early. And so that was my collegiate experience, was the tail end of the 90s, basically. There was a lot of good Star Trek literature that came out in the 80s and then later on in the 90s too. And of course, in the 90s, you get Deep Space Nine and Voyager, those shows. I was not so much into Voyager, but I really love Deep Space Nine. A lot of these books, though, are actually going to be original series. So I'll just go ahead and start with hardbacks. Now, this was one of the first books about just exclusively Vulcan, Spock's world, and Diane Dewan. She was a known artist, or known author rather, for actually crafting a lot of the Romulan and Vulcan worlds that we know today, and that finally were expanded on in Star Trek Picard. So this book right here, I actually got my mom for Christmas in the 1980s, and I forget which year, but I found this in Pigeon Forge outside of Gatlinburg in a store and got this for her for Christmas. So that's the history of this book, Spock's World. Mama was always a Leonard Nimoy fan. I loved him. She loved Spock. And I guess, I just took after my mom because it was actually my mom in the family that liked sci-fi. My dad didn't read and didn't like sci-fi. He read newspapers and periodicals and watched football and news, and that was it. So the sci-fi fan in my entire family was mainly my mom and somewhat my uncle, her brother. But this was actually one of the first Christmas presents as a little girl that I ever gave my mom, and I have it here. I've read it. I read it years ago, and I need to reread it, but I've managed to hang on to this book throughout my collegiate career, throughout grad school, in my 30s, and now my 40s, and I still have this, and it sits on our main bookcase. So it's definitely vintage, and it's not in the best of shape, but I think it is first printing. So, yeah. Now, these are my mother's that she got in the 70s before I was born. This was actually from I think she was a member of a book club back then, because they used to have these mail-in order book clubs. And I know now they have subscription boxes and stuff like that. But these actually came from a book club. And I have 1 and 2 of this. And what these are, these are basically the novelized episodes based on the series. So these are what would have been, the episodic stories, basically short stories. So yeah, and there's a volume 1 and a volume 2, and these are the original copies. These are the original copies. So, and again, this is from, let's see, when was the first one actually came out in? Okay, so a lot of these were copyrighted back in the 60s and 70s when it first aired, and I'm trying to look for the copyright of this date. I think it's 1976, so that's the year before I was born. I was born in 77, so there you go. Now, Barnes & Noble, actually, if you're interested in this and you can't find a copy of this online or at a thrift store, or I like used bookstores. I go to used bookstores a lot. So, not that we have a lot around anymore, but when I find one, I usually patron it as much as I can because I'm always looking for gems like this. So if you want this and you just can't find it, Barnes & Noble a few years ago came out with this. And of course, this is the Barnes & Noble edition. It's the classic episodes of the original series. And it's a really cool book. This is, look, there's the Enterprise. So, Mock Time, that was one of my favorite episodes. That and Balance of Terror, is that the name? Menagerie, everyone I think knows that one now because of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. But yeah, this was something that, I mean, it's something that's just Balance of Terror. Yeah, that was my all-time favorite episode, was Balance of Terror, because that was the first one the Romulans were showcased. Actually, we found out what a Romulan was. So yeah, so this basically is new edition of these two. Okay, so they used to come out with all these manuals. These are from the 70s too. These were my mother's, and this again was bought before I was ever born. And maybe you've seen this, maybe you haven't. But it has like the star dates right here, the episode star dates. This thing kind of toggles. Like, see if I can show it to you, right? That is, so it kind of toggles. You can see right there. So this is really cool because this is basically a concordance, and it's basically a dictionary of everybody. All the information about the different episodes, information, the backstories of the episodes and the different characters, the nemesis and the adventures, oh, here we go. This is Ambassador Sarek. You know, the same actor that played Ambassador Sarek actually played the Romulan commander on Balance of Terror. FYI, it was same actor, Mark Leonard, and he is no longer with us. So that's him as Ambassador Sarek. So this is just a compendium, basically, of all the characters. I think it even has some of the stuff from the, I'm not sure. I think it has stuff from the comic series, the cartoon that came out. But this was something, I'm trying to find another picture. Yes, it did. Remember this race from the cartoon? The cat people. I'll get back to that in a second. So this is the book. It's pretty amazing that I still have it after all these years, but I carry this with me. I had this, my mom, I think, gave this to me when I was in, I guess, middle school. It was something that was in storage, and ever since I've been well, I've always loved Star Trek, but I've had this, I don't even remember when she gave this to me. Maybe it was grammar school. I don't know, but I've always had this. I had this on my shelf as a little girl. So I know most kids have storybooks and fairy tales. I did too, but I also had Star Trek books. This is the the first technical manual, Star Trek technical manual. And what this is the blueprints. Nerds out there, I mean, like I'm not, but I was never good at math, so I call myself a dork, not a nerd. But duh, look at that, like duh, like dork. But yeah, so this is actually, they have this weird letter too, like this mock letter from Starfleet Command. To Balanchine Books, Planetary Agents, United States, Earth, Solar System. Starfleet Command, Starfleet Headquarters, United Federation of Planets, and it has a star date on there, like the star date. And then it says a printed Terran version of Starfleet Technical Manual was approved by the Federation Council for release to civilians and civilian auxiliaries on your planet. We have reviewed copies of this version as printed by you and wish to assure you and the others that these copies are precisely correct and complete as authorized. We believe some of your civilians are confused because they are unfamiliar with the system and arrangement of technical orders. Therefore, we offer the following way of clarification. And it goes on. It's just this mock little letter, and it says "Live long and prosper" right there. It's just this is really cool that I still have all this. I know, but you know, this is just my mom's stuff that she passed on to me. This is a communicator, this ear receiver. Uhura wore that, remember, in her ear. So yeah. And let's see if there's anything more in here. Oh, here's the tricorder. The science is tricorder. Now, I don't know where you could find this other than someplace, maybe like Abe's Books or a used bookstore or a collector. I'm sure if you go to the conventions that they have this. So that's something that's pretty cool. And in the 1990s, when the Next Generation became really popular, I got this at the local, it was Bookland. Remember, in small towns, they had Bookland. They just had Bookland, that was it. And the little Alabama town I lived in, they actually had this, and I got this. I think I got it one Christmas or something, or bought it with allowance money. I don't remember. Yeah, there's a picture of Gene Roddenberry. And this is the blueprints for the Enterprise and, you know, the imaginary warp drive and everything. I think this would be something that you could find easier than the other books that I showed you from the 70s. But this is really neat. I haven't pulled this stuff out in a minute, so it's fun to look at. There's the panel. Yeah, so that is the technical manual for the Next Generation Enterprise D. Yay. Okay, so covered all the hardback stuff. Now I'm just going to do a few of the vintage paperbacks, the mass market paperbacks. I almost split this into 2 videos, but I'm just going to go ahead and do one. I had, of course, this is before I started collecting these, like, as a kid. I think as a teenager I was reading Star Trek novels, but I don't have a lot of them because I've moved and we would trade them back in and stuff. I do have a few, though, that I've found since. I have these I found at used bookstores just for the last few years at various places, and they're in very good condition. Uhura's Song, and again, remember the cat people? This is a really, really interesting novel, and I like it because it has my 2 favorite characters, Spock and Uhura from the original series. I like that it has them with the cat people because I love cats. Kind of like the cat people. It has them on in the book. They're the main characters. And then the Romulan Way. Now this is actually a European or British edition. Let me get the light off of it, of the Romulan Way. So it's going to look a little bit different. I'm just going to show you the American version. The American version is this one. So the red one is American, and this one, and of course we know that the British, they spell words differently, or we spell words differently from them. I have cat hair all over my face. Okay, so this one, I ordered this one online because this actually came from the UK. I ordered this from, I think, Abe's Books, and it came from someplace in the UK, but it's in really good condition. Cover looks nice. A little bit of, you know, just age right there. Now, I did have some Star Trek The Next Generation books. I actually probably read more of the Next Generation books than any other book, DS9 or original series. I never actually got into Voyager as much, so I didn't really read Voyager books. I did like Enterprise, but then it was short-lived, and I think they had some trouble with the writing. But I did like a few, or a lot, back in the day of The Next Generation. So this is Blaze of Glory. And now, if this is an interesting fact about this book, Data's not in the book, really. It's like a lot of new characters, but I like this book because it's about, there's a Romulan or Rigelian space pirate in here, and this is like so not like any of the Next Generation episodes that were back then in the 90s. It's more like an episode of Picard. So that is what's so amazing about this book, because I always wondered if the series Picard didn't get a lot of their ideas from some of the more different books that are now maybe considered canon, that weren't considered canon. But Blaze of Glory, again, Blaze of Glory. So that's one of my favorite Next Generation books, and I had to go and find a copy because I don't have mine from my teenage years. So again, I've moved a lot. I had moved a lot and lost a lot of things and donated a lot of things since then. But a lot of things I did hold on to, like all the hardback books. Now this is just going to be a pile of books that I found at Secondhand Charles. And if you have a Secondhand Charles, that may be a great place to go and find some of the mass paperback vintage books. Just not of Star Trek, but any of the books from the 90s, if you like, or 80s. If you like the older covers and the smaller editions. And I'll just go through these real quick. This is the original series, the Pandora Principle. I'm not going to read the backs. I'll let you do that. I won't sit here and take up time doing that. I want to show you the books instead. This looks really intriguing. It's called Demons, and I think it's about Vulcan. So yeah, that's gonna be one. I haven't read this one before. Like, this was one I hadn't found before. This is one, that Fate of the Phoenix, and again, it's about Vulcanoids. It has something to do with Vulcan people, and I tend to favor the books about Romulans and Vulcans, okay, because I'm not a big fan of the Klingons. So a lot of these books have nothing to do with anything but Romulans or Vulcans. Okay, so this is Unification. I remember waiting the entire summer to see Unification Part 2. Yeah, because that was a thing. They would give a cliffhanger and you'd wait all summer till after school started to see what happened to Spock and the Romulan Empire. So, Unification. And I like that series. I like the melding of the original series with the Next Generation. This was like one of the first crossovers, and everyone was like, oh my goodness, it was a big deal. And of course, there were lots of magazines during this time that came out and talked about this, and I don't have any of those anymore, unfortunately. But this was great. And that's a must-watch episode, especially if you're going to get into Picard or Strange New Worlds. You must see the Unification. Killing Time. This is... again, I'm not sure what this is about, but it is original series. And these are like original paperbacks from like the 80s and the 90s, or the 70s, and maybe late 70s, 80s. A lot of these are going to be 80s. Like with this cover, this style, that's going to be your 80s editions. And I don't think a lot of these are reprinted, honestly. I think you have to get them just on Kindle. I think you can find them on Kindle. Mind Shadow. That's a good one. And the Dreadnought. And again, they used to come out with these really fascinating side characters that you're now seeing in Strange New Worlds, but you used to only see in the books. Because a lot of the writers, here's the thing, a lot of these writers that wrote these books actually wrote episodes for the original series, and then a lot of them carried over to the Next Generation. Some of them, a few of them. They were old at that time though, but yeah. So again, a lot of these are in the 80s. Again, that's very 80s. Diane Carey, that's another author that really shaped a lot of our Federation worlds and the world of Star Trek. And these are all considered, I believe, canon now. Oh, and here's a fantastic one, The Lost Years. The years that we didn't have of the show. So, because remember, the original series didn't run for the typical 7 seasons. It just ran for 3 seasons. And then we had the movies, of course. But The Lost Years. And I think that's all I have to show you of all the vintage Star Trek books I have that are at least the ones I pulled out. I have a lot of the hardback Romulan, like the Ryerson series. the ones that came out in the 2000s that talked about Remus and Romulus, the twin planets, and the whole history of the Great Sundering that happened between the Vulcan and the Romulan people. I may do that for another time because that's going to be really long, and this is already 20 minutes long. But I'm glad I got to show off some original covers. The artwork is just fantastic. Again, beautiful artwork. You can tell this is from the 80s. And again, check out your local bookstores if you really want to see the condition of the book before you buy it. I would do that. I would just go to your local used bookstores, like the ones in little nooks and crannies around your city, and see if you can find some Star Trek books. So anyway, Merry Christmas early, Happy Winter Solstice, and whatever it is you celebrate, Happy Hanukkah. I wish you well.